And welcome once again to Flashpoints. I'm Bob Orr. Joining me, Juan Zarate. He's our national security analyst. Juan, good to see you again.
Bob, good seeing you.
13 years since 9/11, and here we are at another anniversary. And we still have terror threats everywhere.
Yeah, and some would say more dangerous and more diverse than in the past. You've heard American counterterrorism officials and cabinet secretaries talk about how dangerous the environment is, to a certain extent how blind we are to some of the threats facing the West, threats coming out of Syria, for example, or Iraq. But what you have is the reality of a metastasized global jihadi movement with al-Qaeda core in many ways diminished, the group that was led by bin Laden that existed with the Taliban in Afghanistan, not playing such a prominent role, but the other groups playing a more prominent role. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and Yemen, still directly threatening the U.S. Al-Shabaab in Somalia, the U.S. just struck their leader, we think, in that territory. Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, running much of what's happening there. Boko Haram in northern Nigeria, which has caused such a stir with the kidnapping of the girls. And of course, the 800-pound gorilla now, the Islamic State, which has established a foothold in the heart of the Middle East. And so this is a more complicated environment than I think ever before. With what's important here, I think the global jihadi DNA of these groups focus not just on the local fight, but also on trying to attack the United States.
So it's very different. In the bin Laden days, it was a very vertical organization. I mean, the threat came from the top. We knew who the enemy was to a certain degree. Now it's flattened out, but any one of these groups can cause us immediate problems.
No, that's right. You have these groups that have found a way of developing locally, sometimes embedding in local insurgencies like al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula or Al-Shabaab. The Islamic State starts to look like a quasi-army or an insurgency. But they also have cells that are focused on the West. And so they could be fighting in a place like Yemen, but certainly send an operative to blow himself up over the skies of Detroit. And so we've seen that, and we know that. The challenge is you've got all of these global hotspots, all of these groups that can do real damage in an age of globalization when all you really need are a couple of guys with clean passports and with a little bit of training, they could do some real damage.
So you mentioned that. Bin Laden, one of the things he could not do is attract all that many Western recruits. There were some, but not very many Americans flocked to al-Qaeda. Now we see Americans going to Somalia. We see them going to Syria. They've joined ISIS. They've joined al-Nusra in Syria. It just seems to me that the message, the narrative, we're not winning on the narrative.
Bob, I think you are absolutely right. I think the ideology and the narrative that al-Qaeda spawned not only animates these groups and ties them in a variety of ways, but also is animating independent actors, the lone wolves, and the actors in the West, and drawing them to these fights and potentially drawing them back to attack their home countries. And I think what we've seen in the context of Syria and Iraq is the largest flow of foreign fighters than we've ever seen. It eclipses what we saw during the Afghan Mujahideen days, the fight of the Soviets. It eclipses what we saw in the height of the foreign fighter problem post 2003. And so this is a real problem because the movement is gaining momentum in terms of the ideology. And I think you're right. The problem here is we have a challenge of the narrative that is animating a lot of these individuals and these groups.
So back to where we started as we wrap up. If you had to calibrate the threat as it compared to September 10th, 2001, would you say it's greater? I know it's different, but what's your assessment?
I'm not sure I would say it's greater. I would say it's more complex, it's different, and it's real. But I'm not sure I'd say it's greater, in part because I think we have a better counterterrorism architecture both in the United States and around the world to deal with these problems. But the reality is we're still blind in very dangerous corners of the world, like Syria, and that makes it feel a bit like September 10th, 2001. And you're going to start hearing more and more politicians, counterterrorism officials around the world talk about that fear that we're facing a threat that we may not see yet, but that may come to bite us at home.
Juan, thanks as always.
Thank you, Bob.
And thanks to you for watching Flashpoints. I'm Bob Orr. We'll see you next time.